Hello everyone, today I'm bringing you the much delayed Mannequin of the Month for March 2025. I did explain earlier in the month why there'd been a delay. Obviously Mannequin of the Month normally comes out on the 1st each month, and in this case it's coming out mid-month. The topic we're going to talk about here was of course chosen via a poll over on Patreon, which is the way Mannequin of the Month is selected each month. And for those who follow on Patreon, those who are subscribed on Patreon, obviously the poll for the next one for April will be coming out very soon, as it's actually not that long until the 1st of April now, of course. What we're talking about is the kit of an infantryman in the Berlin Brigade, the British Army, circa 1969. And there are various details which sort of mark out that time period. The 1960 pattern combat uniform, we have 1958 pattern equipment here, a mix of different components from different sort of issues of this. So as we've mentioned in recent videos looking at the ammunition pouches, there were various versions of these which were issued at different points, and the design slowly evolved. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specific components we have here as well. It's quite nice really. It ties together some recent videos looking at 1958 pattern components, the ammunition pouches, the water bottles and so forth. So we'll talk a bit more about that as we move around. We'll start at the top as we normally do with these, however, and talk about the quite distinctive headgear we have here. And this is the British issue combat cap dating back to the Korean War, and it's part of the Korean War combat uniform. It's made of a very finely woven gabardine cloth, has a neck curtain, as you can see here. There's a chin strap at the front here and the stiffened peak, and then there are ventilation eyelets, which we'll see as we move this round. As I say, quite a distinctive piece of headgear, and designed as part of the Korean War era cold weather combat uniform. And that combat uniform, much as it can be worn in more temperate climes, is really designed for cold weather use. And the combat cap, obviously having the neck curtain and so forth, sort of fits that role rather well. And there are specific details of how to wear this in cold weather to provide maximum insulation. But there were large stocks of these which hadn't been used up. And in the late 60s and into the early 70s, there was basically an order that these were to be used up. And they appear with troops of British Army of the Rhine generally, and particularly the Berlin Brigade. These were worn even with DPM uniform for a time after DPM was introduced. So quite a distinctive piece of headgear, and something that you see re-emerges, resurfaces in the late 60s, early 70s, obviously having been introduced in the early 1950s. So quite a distinctive piece of headgear, as I say, and we'll have a look at that, some of the other features of that as we move the mannequin around in a minute. The basic uniform consists of the 1960 pattern combat uniform. Of course, this would be worn with 1960 pattern combat trousers, anklets or puttees, and DMS boots, of course, by this point. At the collar, you can see we have the wool flannel shirt underneath there, which potentially would be a 1950s example or the 1964 pattern. Both were still in use at this time. And of course, going into the 70s, you'd have a change to that with the move to a wool mix shirt, but this is made of wool flannel. And that's the basic uniform. As already mentioned, the equipment is 1958 pattern, and we have a mix of components here. We have a webbing belt here, which is difficult to actually tell the difference between the earlier and later versions of the belt. Just looking at them, the length changes slightly for the sizes. So we have a belt there, difficult to tell which issue this is, but we do have two second issue ammunition pouches here, and we'll see a little bit more of these as we move them around. They're carried round on the hips as far as they can be, which is convenient in that they hang low below the belt. So not only for going prone, but also generally for moving around. If they're round on the hips, they don't interfere with the legs in quite the same way. Though this was an issue for certain infantrymen who were pretty slim. They ended up further around the front of the belt than was really comfortable. The yoke supports these directly with a strap coming down to the back of the pouches. There's a ring which this loops through, this strap here loops through, then up through this buckle, and you can actually tighten this down while wearing the equipment, which is quite convenient. We then have D-rings up on the section here where it attaches, where this 1-inch strap attaches onto the wider section, which goes over the shoulders. We have this D-ring here, which was for attaching the pack, and the pack isn't carried in this instance. It wasn't supposed to be carried, generally speaking. It did end up being carried more generally later on, but at this time, this is the basic sort of fighting order and what would be worn in the field when moving around in armoured personnel carriers and so forth. And that was the intention behind this. The pack was not supposed to be carried in the field, generally speaking. It was really for marching order, changing stations and that sort of thing. So the pack is not carried. That's the front of the mannequin. We'll start moving this around now and have a look at some of the other details. Moving on to look at the right-hand side of the mannequin here, we'll again start at the top and work down. And you can see the side profile of the combat cap here, the stiffened peak, the two ventilation eyelets up in the crown of which are the same as used in the British jungle hat, basically the mesh eyelets you can see here. And then you have the neck curtain here, which is kept up in place with two small press studs, one attaching it up to the crown of the hat and the other clipping it onto itself, basically. You can see that there. Moving down, something you may be able to see here, this is the second version of the yoke for the 1958 pattern, and it has a loop here which is supposed to guide the strap which comes up from the pack and hooks onto the D-ring. So this was a later addition to stop that strap slipping off this wide section which passes over the shoulder. So this is not a first issue, it's a slightly later issue version of the yoke which was in use and being issued at this time. You see the epaulette on the shoulder of the combat smock there. And then an interesting deviation from normal British practice. Generally speaking, formation signs were not worn on British combat uniform. If they were worn on brassards, but generally rank was worn and not much else. But in the case of the Berlin Brigade badge was worn, and you can see that here. The red ring, which obviously has a fairly obvious meaning, with Berlin above, and this is the second version. Originally it was just the red ring on a black background, but here you have Berlin added over the top as well on this later design. And this is what you would see in the later 1960s worn on combat uniform, and this carried on through for wearing combat uniform into the era of DPM. So a common thing to see, and it's quite useful, and it marks out troops of the Berlin Brigade very easily in period photographs. So interesting use of formation sign on the combat uniform there. You can see this is a second issue version of the 1960 pattern combat uniform. There were two versions of the smock. The first was closer to the Korean War, the late Korean War combat uniform in sateen, combat jacket, combat smock rather. This is the second issue, which simplified the elbow reinforcement by having a small half circle here and another one here, rather than one large section of elbow reinforcement which passed right the way around the arm. So if you're looking to differentiate these, you have one large elbow patch. There are other minor differences as well, but that's the most obvious visual difference. And you can see there the button cuff of the combat uniform there, which can be the combat smock, which can be adjusted in as required. If we lift the sleeve out of the way, we can see more clearly here the right-hand ammunition pouch, which of course has the pouch for the Energo rifle grenade adapter, which we've talked about in a recent video, and that's marks this out as the right-hand pouch. It also has the ring here at the base on the right-hand side as you carry it, on the left-hand side as you're looking at it, which clips onto the cape carrier, which you can see the strap of the cape carrier coming around here and clipping on. And then we also have a water bottle, of course. Water bottle had been introduced after the initial issue of 1958 pattern in the early 1960s, and so you have the water bottle in the first pattern water bottle pouch or water bottle carrier there, which of course has a twist lock on the flap rather than the later strap. The second design with the strap was in production by this point, but you still see a huge number of these issued out. Obviously, if you've been issued a water bottle pouch, you're not going to get it taken off you and a new one issued just because the design's changed. So that's the first version of the water bottle pouch there. We'll move this around now and have a look at the back. So at the back of the mannequin here, there's not a huge amount to talk about with the hat and the uniform, but the equipment, there's a bit to talk about. You can again see here the loops up on the shoulder there, which would pass the straps of the pack through if carrying the pack. And you can see here the fitting for carrying the entrenching tool, the lightweight pick or lightweight shovel on the back there. There's a male lifter dot fastener there, which passes through a hole in the handle of these tools, and then the handle passes down here. Obviously the shovel head is fixed and passes down. The shovel head sits around here. For the pick, it's in two pieces. You carry the handle down the back, and then there's a neat carrier in the cape carrier here, which allows you to carry the pick head in there if an entrenching tool was being carried. It isn't in this instance, which is very common to see in period photographs. On the back of the belt, we have the rear pouches, commonly referred to as kidney pouches for obvious reasons, where they sit on the equipment. And these would carry mess tins, spare clothing, socks, that sort of thing, spare underwear, washing and shaving items, boot cleaning equipment, that sort of thing was the typical contents for these. Rations packed in the mess tins as well, and the hexi stove potentially as well. So the rear pouches there. These are second issue examples. They've had the stiffening removed from the side of the lids or flaps there, but they don't yet have the upper set of, there's a set of loops and a quick release tab, which on the third version of these actually hooks them up to the upright strap on the back of the yoke to keep them closer into the body. As you can see here, they sag away. And so these have been slightly simplified in having that stiffening removed. So they're the second issue in that they've been simplified. The third issue would modify these again to attach up to the upright straps on the yoke. Underneath those, we have the cape carrier here, and that's the official nomenclature for it, but obviously referred to as the poncho roll, and it does indeed contain the poncho. The understanding is this was initially designed to carry the ground sheet cape, colloquially referred to, the cape which had existed prior to this, which is of course basically a design dating back to the First World War, latterly made in a green canvas and obviously buttoned around the body, or could be used as a ground sheet. That was still on issue at the time. 1958 pattern was introduced. In 1962, a poncho was introduced, and then that was carried in the equipment using the same piece of equipment. So we have a 1962 pattern poncho within the cape carrier here, and this is a first issue cape carrier, only marked out by the fact it has a small crimped tip on this strap here rather than a larger riveted example. These pulled off very easily, so the design was modified to use the older style of tip in aluminium with a rivet, as had been used on 1944 pattern, and that improved the design somewhat. It also lacks the third adjustment point for the quick release, so there are only 2 of these loops. On the later examples of these, you end up with 3. To give a little bit more volume for carrying MVC kit in particular. It was very useful, but certainly gives you a bit more volume to carry a bit of extra kit in here if required. That's the back of the mannequin. We'll move this around now to have a look at the left-hand side. Looking at the left-hand side here, you can see we have the Berlin Brigade badge on both arms. There's not a huge amount more to talk about in terms of the uniform and the hat here. The hat is a mirror image, as is the uniform. So we left the cuff unbuttoned there, but never mind. Lifting the arm out of the way, we don't have the water bottle pouch here, so you've just got a bit of a gap on the belt there so that the ammunition pouches are evenly spaced and make the equipment comfortable to wear. On the left-hand ammunition pouch, we of course have the bayonet for the SLR, the self-loading rifle, the L1A1, carried on the side of the pouch. As mentioned in a recent video looking at these pouches, a feature carried across from the 1944 pattern equipment, and quite a convenient place to carry it. It's nice and secure there, not flopping around in a separate frog. And then otherwise, the pouch is a mirror image of the other side, just replacing the Energa pouch with the loops for the bayonet on the side there. As you can see, it clips onto the cape carrier, as you can see there, which sort of stabilizes the whole lot and pulls these ammunition pouches back a little bit away from the legs, which is a useful feature of the design. So that's the left-hand side there, and that's basically it for the kit and the uniform on the mannequin. So I hope you found it interesting looking at this. As I say, I was quite pleased that this topic came top of the poll over on Patreon, because it does tie together some of the videos talking about 1958 pattern, which I've uploaded recently. So from that point of view, quite nice to do. And it's nice to dig out the combat cap, which I'm not sure is actually something I've covered on the channel previously. So that might have to come up in a video in the not too distant future, looking at that in a bit more detail. Certainly it's something I want to talk about at some point. So that may well come up on the channel soon. If it's not something I've talked about already, I'll have to check back through the back catalogue. But as I say, I do hope you found it interesting looking at this. If you have and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing, you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. If you really like my uploads and you'd like to support the channel, you can. Both Patreon and PayPal are linked down below. A huge thank you as ever to everybody who supports the channel using those 2 methods. I really do appreciate it a huge amount. It really is greatly appreciated, and I want to say thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to vote each month on what's going to be covered in Mannequin of the Month, it's the Corporal tier over on Patreon, which gives you that option. If you'd like to follow the channel on social media, you can. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter are all linked down below, and of course there will be photographs of this posted up over on those platforms as well. And if you'd like to get in touch with me but you don't really use social media, there is of course an email address in the description as well. That's everything for this video, so until next time, bye for now.